Hello and welcome to everyone out there in the Actual Tech Media audience. Thanks so much for joining us on today's webinar. The topic is 5 key ingredients of a modern BCDR strategy. Of course, that's business continuity and disaster recovery. On this event, you'll learn from our experts the 5 key ingredients that you need to take into account for the future when it comes to business continuity and disaster recovery. I mean, with ransomware hitting companies of all sizes left and right, this is a hot topic that I encourage everyone to tune into. We've got a great discussion lined up here today. Before we get started, I first want to give a special thanks to our sponsors here on the event. Thank you to Rubrik and Microsoft for supporting us. I encourage you to check out the handouts tab there for additional information. Now, I should mention, my name is David Davis of Actual Tech Media, and I'll be serving as the moderator here on the event. As always, we want these events to be educational, and we encourage your questions there in the questions tab of your audience console. We'll be doing a live Q&A session at the end of the event, so keep those questions coming. And then at the end of the webinar, I'll be announcing the winner of our Visa $300 gift card door prize. If you're watching this on demand, of course, that drawing would have already occurred. The prize terms and conditions can be found right there in the handouts tab of your audience console. And then to further encourage some of those questions you might be considering asking, but you're not quite sure if you should, we have our best question prize. This is for an additional Visa gift card, a $50 Visa gift card. Of course, that means you have to ask a question to be entered into the prize drawing. We'll be reviewing those questions and contacting the best question prize winner after the event. All right, and with that, it's now my pleasure to bring in today's expert presenters. I'd like to introduce you to Natasha Loeffler-Little, who is a Principal Product Manager at Rubrik. Also, welcome to Mike Preston, Technical Marketing Engineer at Rubrik. And then finally, to Carl Rautenstronk, who is a Principal Product Manager at Microsoft. Natasha, Mike, and Carl, it's a pleasure to have you on. I'll first hand it off to you, Natasha. Take it away.
Well, welcome everybody here to this joint webinar between Microsoft and Rubrik. Welcome, Carl and Mike. How are you guys today?
Good. Thanks for having us, Natasha.
Thanks. Yeah, last week, Adam and I spent some time unpacking this conversation about BCDR, buzzwords that are often used, and some of the things that we think are most important. And I'm really excited to welcome both of you today to continue that conversation and get into some of the questions that we were asked by the audience. And, really looking at your top 5 for an effective BCDR strategy. Carl, could you give us some context and background about where you come from and what you're excited to share today?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of my favorite topics. I've got a lot of personal experience in this arena, both as a customer. I spent many years in both the power industry and the insurance industry, where I was responsible for business continuity initiatives before finally moving to the vendor side of the house, or the dark side, as many customers say, where I helped my customers, the companies that became my customers, with similar topics. And I've seen a lot change over the years, from physical Unix and Windows and then Linux systems to virtualization and now cloud. I'm happy to share those lessons learned with our audience today.
Yeah, and I think one of the advantages of having Microsoft here on the phone is that scale that you're able to offer with that expertise. And so I'm excited that you get to scale your information and share it with us today. Mike, from the Rubrik side, how about you?
Yeah, sort of the same background as Carl. I spent 20 years on the customer side, sort of living through all of these things, all of these disasters and different things, and all the different transitions to technology. And love the fact that I can back up and recover things so much. I decided to jump to Rubrik and work for Rubrik for the past 5 years now. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell. Working tech marketing here in Rubrik and loving it every day. So
awesome. Yeah, and I love that. This idea of sharing is really what we're doing here today. So let's go ahead and dive into those 5 points that we wanted to talk about today. And the first one, I'm going to open it up to you two, is this idea of continuously testing and updating your plans. Um, what are your key thoughts on this being one of the top 5?
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and start. One, I couldn't agree more. I mean, if this isn't number one, the remaining four better be awfully good. But in my career, I worked for companies where we were able to test once per year, either because of contractual agreements or just the sheer complexity of the plan and the application environments we were trying to protect. And I don't have any shame in telling you that in all those years of testing that plan once a year, we were successful exactly 0 times. And the reason for that is there are a lot of changes that occur over the course of a year. And if you are not able to test frequently and as new applications come online, you will fail. It's just a fact. Environments are too complex to really survive without frequent testing.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Mike, how about you? What would you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. You go through all this effort to develop, these different response plans for things, and by the time you're done, like sometimes they can take months to get done, to get everything identified and put in there, and they're outdated by the time you're done. Things change so fast now, and we got data living on prem and in the cloud, and it's just moving around everywhere, and we need to somehow come up with a way to protect and restore all of this stuff. And without continuous testing, you won't identify any of those little subtle things. Like I've seen, I've went through times where I've developed certain response plans and executed them, and then thought, oh, when you test it, you're like, oh, I need DNS. I totally forgot about DNS. Small little tiny infrastructure things that you don't notice. And the idea is the testing allows you to sort of make that a living document and keep that updated. Like you'll probably should be updating it every single time you test, because you'll more than likely find something new.
That's awesome, Mike. And I think this is a really great point to hit on, following up from the conversation last week, because of the fact that we were asked by a number of audience members, how often should I be updating my plan? What are some of these other considerations? And often our response was, it depends. And I would say this is probably why Carl just said this is number one, is it depends largely on what's happening in your testing response. I think I'm hearing that correctly, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would say so.
And the
Yeah,
little details you're
absolutely.
finding. Yeah. And also, I think one of the things that we find with our clients and just this particular task of tackling BCDR is that, the hope is that you figure it out before a disaster or a cyber attack happens. And the devil is in the details, right? Like those nuances you talked about, Mike, you gave a good example there. So continuous testing and updating your plans. Anything else you guys want to add to that?
Really, just one quick thing. I think a way to gauge this and kind of make it a little easier to execute on is not thinking of disaster recovery, not thinking of business continuity as something that you do or you think about and you instantiate once a year or a few times a year. It really needs to become part of every application deployment plan. So when is the best time to update your plan? It's when you're rolling out a new application. Does it require a level of continuity services where it has to be up and running in the event of a disaster? Or is it something that's not business critical? And yes, I need to protect it, absolutely. But do I need to worry about having it back up and running within 24 hours or within a week? You have to understand the criticality. You have to include continuity planning as part of every single application deployment.
I like that. I like the concreteness of that too, Carl. Thanks for that.
I would totally add
Well,
as well. And I know we're going to talk about stakeholders and things like that and who to involve and whatnot. But I think, after you identify that, they should also be involved in these testing processes, because the last thing you're going to want is, disaster strikes, you're going through this great plan you have, and you contact someone and they're like, who are you? What's going on? So yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect segue into the next top point, which is identifying and involving the proper stakeholders. So, Mike, why don't you continue to talk about that a little bit more?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've lived through some situations, and I have some really nasty examples. But things happen, and you need to really identify who needs to be involved. This isn't just an IT problem, especially when we start looking at business continuity, right? Um, if our sort of data centers are down, or we have no internet or things like that, and we're trying to recover from that scenario, you need things like, maybe you need things like procurement during that time. Maybe you need to get new hardware, you need to get new software, you need to buy new stuff. Procurement needs to be part of all these discussions, things like payroll and all of that. So you really need to take a really holistic view, take a step back, and really look at your whole organization and just think, what, if this business is gone, like, and I bring it back up somewhere else, or with other people,
Mhm.
how's this going to work? So
Yeah. Again, those subtle nuances, and I love the example of procurement. Carl, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I really could not agree more. I mean, just minor additions along the exact same lines. You have to think about the business stakeholders, and really, that becomes part of, well, what is that criticality? How do I define how I need to protect this particular application? The best way to do that is to talk to the business owners and understand how they're using it. Is it a critical part of how they do business? Up
Mhm.
front, they're very, very important to have in the process, and in the actual testing and the activating of a DR plan. Increasingly, your internal developers are a critical part of that process as well. I was part of an early DevOps adopting company, and we had so much custom code, and we had developers so heavily ingrained into our process of keeping an application up and running properly, that they needed to be part of that process. They needed to be part of that plan to validate that the application was online correctly and was healthy. So it really is, it's expansive. It is far outside of just the IT operations folks. And I hope that's something that it kind of causes a light bulb to go off for some of the folks on this call, and it can mean the difference between success and failure.
Yeah, I hope the same, Carl. And I think you're both addressing something else that the audience had asked, which was around rallying early and strong support for the financial cost of creating the plan, all the things that go into it. And you didn't specifically address this, but I think we could safely say, or I can safely say with your advice here, that having those folks from across the business really understanding that a plan needs to be in place and that there are certain things that would need to be there or assigned responsibilities to make it happen can and should also really be part of affecting the support and the escalation for having the funding for such programs, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It was the only way I was able to get sign off to acquire the equipment that we needed for the disaster recovery site when I worked in the power industry.
Mhm.
Without having executive sign off, without having their input and understanding of the impact to the business, you're not going to be able to move forward. And while cloud does lower some of those costs, because this is an arena where pay for what you use
Mhm.
really, really can provide some financial benefits, there are still checks that need to be written, and you
Mhm.
have to have that sign off and endorsement.
Yeah, fabulous. All right. Well, and along these same lines, I'm moving on to our third of the five, this idea of assigning responsibility. It's related, but slightly different. So, Carl, why don't you go ahead and start talking about? You started to allude to it, so I'm going to let you keep going on this concept.
Yeah, no worries. And I enjoyed speaking with both you and Mike earlier as well on this topic. I'm a big believer that it takes more than good automation, and automation is really important. but we still need people in this in this world. AI hasn't replaced us all yet, right? And people knowing what's expected of them during a disaster is absolutely critical to making sure that you are able to get back up and running within your SLAs. You're able to meet that recovery time objective. And the way that we handled this, I live in Florida. We have a little problem with hurricanes. The way that we handled this at the companies that I worked for was we had a storm team. So we rotated members who were responsible during given months for moving to our safe location, to our bunker, in the event of a disaster, and providing those critical services, whether it was storage, database administration, development, whatever the case may be. You knew what your responsibility was and when you were responsible for it. And that is something that you don't want to leave to chance. You want to include in your plan.
Being really specific. Yeah. And Mike, you had some points on this as well that I'd love to hear.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the last thing you want to do when you're scrambling around and you're running, and I shouldn't say scrambling around. If you have a great plan, it should be step by step. But the last thing you want to do is just assume somebody else is going to take care of something else, and that could be something technical. It could be who's notifying certain customers or certain business units, things like that. It really needs to be clearly laid out, who's going to be doing what. And I say who, and you almost don't need to assign it to a person, because people move, people leave, new people join, people go through different positions. So it's almost assign it to a position. And again, that has to be all updated within that BCDR plan that you have. So there's another trigger point where you need to upgrade your plan, is when different people move positions and things like that. So it just makes things go so much easier when everybody knows who's doing what. We're not interrupting people as they're going through their processes and doing different things like that.
Yeah, those are great points. And one of the questions we were asked, which I think some of the examples you provided, depending on the company, they may or may not have those roles, or the size of the team may vary. Or I also think we're introducing the geographical element, like I don't have hurricanes or earthquakes. And we are jointly talking regularly about the growing threat of ransomware and the different types of cyber attacks. So perhaps two parts to this question. One is, when you're looking at assigning responsibilities and how it relates to a BCDR plan, how are you thinking about this depending on the size of the company? And does that even matter? That was one of the audience questions we were asked.
Yeah, this is an area where I don't think the size of the company matters, and the size of the staff matters. I know it can be a lot harder to get things done when you are part of a smaller organization, when you're someone that wears multiple hats. I know that all too well. I started with a small company myself, a small internet company. But the fact is, it has to be done. This is something that everyone has to have a plan for, and maybe your role in building that plan or executing that plan is not one item, one area, one application. Maybe it's multiple, maybe it's the entire environment. But this is something that you have to approach your leadership about, get the time allocated to build and spend time on a project like this. Because to your point, if you're waiting and you're trying to figure this all out, when it hits the fan, it's too late, and that can be the end of that company. Mm-hmm. So it is important, and the steps taken, the steps necessary, don't change. But some of those factors, like the people involved and the scope, certainly can with different size organizations.
Yeah, I would agree. I would think too, like, complexity comes into thought. Like when you have a very large organization, or maybe you have a team of 100 or 200 people that are actually looking after your BCDR and executing all this stuff. it makes it a bit easier because yeah, you are more scoped in your role as to what you need to do, but it adds a massive amount of complexity in terms of, we say like herding cats, trying to get everybody on the same page versus maybe a small business that's doing the same thing has a group of 10 people that sit in a room every day together anyways versus 500 people that are globally dispersed all over the world. So
Yeah.
And you don't have to do it all yourself. I mean, a small company I worked for, we engaged a consultancy. We had them come in and help us. And sometimes just having someone there to put in that initial framework, and then it becomes a maintenance effort rather than a creation effort, can really help you fill that necessary gap. And of course, having the right tooling as well is absolutely key. If you can avoid having a plan that involves, step one, execute this script, and step 20 is still on execute script 20, you've made your life really difficult. So the right tooling makes a huge difference.
Yeah, simplicity is key. Yeah, and I think you've hit on some other points that was sort of the second prong to this because disaster recovery today has an expanded definition from even just a couple of years ago. And I think all of the ingredients that you just mentioned and considerations around making time to look at the plan and to plan for the plan and assigning the right people, um, and also having the right help if you need it, if you don't have the time or the resources, looking out, having the right tools, that those should also be in place to help you determine all the flavors of disaster that you can be impacted by. And all of us collectively know ransomware is not discriminating against company size, even industry. There's some that are hit more than others, but that this is really a call for all sizes and types of organizations. Would you agree?
100%.
Yeah. Um, great. So assigning the responsibility, and then we've just started to talk about this, but this fourth point of ensuring proper communication during the response. Something happens. How do we talk about it? So I'm going to let you guys unpack this one because we can go a couple different directions, and I know you both have some really important points here.
yeah, for sure. I mean, on the technical side, you know, you start thinking about, what would you do, if you're all sitting in the office and there's no internet, or everything's down, there's no internet. Are we able to still communicate through email? Has email been impacted? Things like that. It's really, there's a lot to think about, especially because every disaster is going to be different and you can't plan for everything. It's impossible. I know we always say it, you should have all these, different scenarios, but you can't plan, and there's going to be a surprise probably every single time. But trying to sort of anticipate what it's going to be like, without any communication, can we do this? Do we have a list of phone numbers somewhere? Oh, that's in it. Yeah, sure we do. It's in a file on the file server, which is, completely encrypted. So things like that. Just being able to
Yeah.
communicate during an attack or during the response, I think, is super important.
Yeah,
Yeah.
couldn't agree more. I mean, it sounds kind of old school, but having a phone tree or a text tree, right, for an all up enterprise wide disaster, and then Mike had a really great point there. Maybe it's not enterprise wide, but it's an application. We were hit with ransomware here, and email is down. Having those phone or text trees set up for individual critical applications can be really important too, because we're not just talking about a site-wide disaster or a company-wide disaster. The outage of a critical application can be considered a disaster, and you need to have recovery efforts and responsibilities and contact lists for those critical applications down to that level.
Yeah. Um, and you said old school, but I just think of this as like start from the bottom and work your way up. Like it doesn't have to be hard or complicated. It can be really simple. And I think that was all really great advice. And some of the folks joining us may be on a later stage of their journey of really refining their BCDR process and have some established baseline that you guys just described, and might be thinking about optimizing the plan. And I think the optimization of the communication that could happen is an interesting one for us to add to this. So when you think about how different teams can communicate during a disaster, what might you include in a plan to account for this, like, I've done it, I've done the basics, and now I'm starting to think about how I can make my speed to recovery even faster?
Hmm,
You got us
great
thinking now.
question. Yeah. You've stumped us, Natasha. um, yeah, it's a great question. I think really, I would say making sure that you have as much automated as possible is key. We've been talking a lot about the people aspect of this and how important the people are, but I was only half kidding when I was referring to scripts for recovery earlier. We did have quite a few when I was responsible for efforts in the power industry, and the reality is that everything that we had scripted that at that point needed to be called at various stages manually could absolutely be automated. And there's so much sophisticated tooling, and I've certainly seen this with Rubrik Cloud On, that allows you to invoke kind of the basics of what do I need to bring online and in what order, but also allows you to inject some customization and do those things that we relied on as manual scripts as proven run books that are part of that activity. So for me, when it comes to shortening that time to recovery, that's where having really good and proven and tested and validated automation can be the difference between coming back in minutes or hours and taking days to get an application back online.
Yeah, I'll add to that, Carl, because you've highlighted something that is core to you and I as product managers, which is developing something that's going to delight the end customer, right? And I also think this is where Microsoft and Rubrik together have really thought about that, and as a critical piece of not in the name of improving communication, like we're talking about right here under this of our top five, but ensuring that that there's nothing cumbersome stopping folks from being able to get back online and to be able to protect their data, right? So you didn't call it out that way, but I can see the spirit of your being a product manager started early thinking about the end users. Did
I
you
would
have
And
say
I'm proud of
too.
myself that I've only mentioned one product name.
I would definitely say, when you're looking at improving speed and RTO and things like that, like leveraging the scale of cloud, like things are a little, like things are more complex now than ever, but they're easier than ever in some ways as well. Like cloud has added the automation and built all that scale and redundancy and things for us. So, things like cross-region replication and all that stuff allows you to easily get redundancy and easily, sort of bring things back online in a completely other spot.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Mike. And also really important because it's one of our top fives, is like having the right tools in place, right? And beyond cloud, what would you add to that list?
For me, I'm kind of an automation junkie, so I would say things like if you could, I guess it's more about how you develop your infrastructure or how you architect your infrastructure using things like infrastructure as code. I think makes
Mhm.
things so much easier in the long run if you need to rebuild that infrastructure or bring it up somewhere else. Um, Anything you can do to remove dependencies on different things, really helps as well. And of course, have yourself a some sort of great, data security, data backup application in place so you could, make sure that your data is protected and readily available when you need to get at it, for sure.
Mhm. Love that. Carl?
And really, the only thing I would add is connectivity. It's
Mhm.
something that we don't often think about, but if the disaster did impact an office and people's ability to get into a location where there's secure connectivity to the recovery environment, you have to have a plan in place. And one of the nice side effects, if we can call it that, of our time during the pandemic here was the fact that remote work has become so pervasive, but making sure that extends to an application or site recovery environment is really critical. Maybe the response is virtual desktops. Maybe the response is, okay, we're going to enforce by policy that all either home equipment or obviously work equipment is enabled with VPN connectivity, with policies assigned that will make sure that we're not going to introduce some net new threat into the environment during a non-normal working scenario. That's really the only other thing that I can think of that you want to make sure you have buttoned down prior.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
And again, I think this is the spirit of this particular session is sharing these types of things so that others don't have to go through it. So really taking that into consideration and looking at the shared experiences to make us all stronger and better. One of the questions that we had from the last session that's related to this was asking about taking cost and speed of recovery into consideration when you're planning how you tier your backup plans. And again, here I start to think about this as a tooling question. I know it has other buckets and categories that we could put in, but maybe Carl, do you want to talk about how you discuss that typically, or how you've worked with that in the past?
Yeah, absolutely. And really, when we look at that, the traditionally, and I think this still very much holds true today, the less time a particular tool set takes you to recover in the event of disaster, the lower the RTO, the more expensive that solution will be.
Hmm.
And it comes from a couple of different factors. I'm keeping a warm site as opposed to a cold site where I have a copy of my data, but I need to recover that data in a usable form before I'm up and running. That takes longer than having a warm site where I'm replicating that data in near real time, and I effectively have a standby environment that I can activate with the push of a few buttons.
Hmm.
So it's very, very rare that a company can afford that highest level of service and lowest um, time to recover, lowest RTO for every single application they have. So assigning business criticality, understanding what does need to come up soonest, what requires that highest level of um, of protection and highest level of recoverability in terms of time to recover is really important. You want to make sure that you are setting yourself up with something that allows you to get the business up and running, but also doesn't break the bank and adds such an expensive insurance policy that you've made your cogs, you've made your cost of product or your cost of what you're delivering to the industry too high to be competitive.
Hmm.
So understanding what you have and assigning the right criticality and using the right tools is absolutely key there.
Yeah. It goes back to one of the first points we made, earlier points rather, that talking early and wide to different groups to really get that understanding and that as part of the plan, really, right? Yeah, great point. Mike, do you have something to add to that, or?
Yeah, sure. I can take more of an approach, moving away from applications and thinking more just about data itself and maybe just backups. Um, Certainly, as any backup administrator, I've done it for 20 years. Like you want to have as many backups as you possibly can. And there's regulations in a lot of places that says, well, you need to have 7 years worth. And we all know we're not touching data that's 7 years old, right? It's not, we're just not going to ever restore that. It's just sitting around for the auditors and things like that to look
Mhm.
at. And, as much as, companies like us here at Rubrik will say, sure, we can sell you, enough Rubrik to keep all of your data on the Rubrik platform for 7 years. If you want to do that, go ahead. It's going to cost you a lot of money though. So, ideally, what you'll do is keep your most recent backups, you sort of ready to restore, ready to go. They're really, really local. And then tier those older backups, leveraging things like cloud, like Microsoft Azure, and storage accounts to, hot and cold storage, depending on their
Mhm.
age. And, having a product in place that can leverage those technologies as cloud providers are spitting them out and spinning them out for us is, a great option to sort of save money and save cost.
Yeah, I think that's great. And related to that, Mike, we were also asked in several different variations if corporations or organizations should make their backups air gapped and immutable, and does the size of the corporation matter in that? And I would add, or the industry.
Yeah, I don't think the size matters. I don't think the industry matters. I mean, the size is probably going to have a big impact on how much budget you have and
Mhm.
to do some of this stuff. But definitely, I would say every organization should try and have some sort of air gap backup in place.
Yeah.
Things like ransomware now, the attackers, they're not just going after production data anymore. They're getting inside your networks. They're sitting there. They're watching things for months. And they don't want you restoring. They want the money. They want you to pay. So they're going to go after your backups as well. So having, a backup platform in place that provides things like, and I know Natasha, you and Adam talked about immutability and, logically air gapped and not being exposed to the network. All of these things are super important. And I would recommend for every organization of any size to have this stuff in place.
Yeah, it's good advice. We'll put a pin in that. Um, so wrapping it up, I'd love for each of you to share just some parting words for folks, like your summary word or a couple of sentences to leave folks with today.
Yeah, I have to go back to our first topic, and that is make sure that you have more than just yourself or your team involved in this process. You have to have the business stakeholders invested. You have to have your development organization invested. If you have internal developers, the DBAs, if they're a separate team, a separate part. This is really an area where it does literally take a village to be successful, to keep your company safe, to keep your business safe. And I can't emphasize that enough. I went through that process as a very young, early in career individual who's extremely intimidated to go and talk to directors and VPs who were responsible for our energy trading organization. Um, but doing what I was encouraged to do by a director I worked for, who I will always be eternally grateful to. It allowed me not only to learn, but to build a plan that was meaningful and has been in place for years, and at this point almost decades with that company that I worked for. So um, it's worth it. Step outside your comfort zone, work with those people you normally wouldn't, and it will absolutely pay off with a business continuity plan you can be proud of and will work.
Very wise words. Thank you, Carl. Mike.
Yeah, I mean, so sort of in a past life in a consultancy role that I had, my advice would be, when you're first taking a look at some of this stuff, because it can be really overwhelming to say, okay, I'm going to develop a plan that's going to, provide business continuity for this entire organization for every, application. And now it's even worse because you got data in cloud and on-prem and everywhere. Start small. Start, maybe take, one application and start documenting around it and figuring out what it's going to take to get that
Mhm.
application up and running, somewhere else, whether that's going to be in cloud or at another warm site or something like that. take a look at all the dependencies. Quite often, all those dependencies that you define for that first application are probably going to support the rest of the organization and the rest of the applications. But start small and get that quick win with one application, and then just keep going from there.
I love that. Start small, step out of your comfort zone. This was an absolute pleasure for me to speak to both of you. I think the most awesome thing about these sessions is that we have this combined shared passion for companies being successful with their cybersecurity. The shared passion between Rubrik and Microsoft, and this discussion, for me at least personally, was no exception to that. So thank you, Carl, for your time. Thank you, Mike, for your time. And, for others, you can find more information at rubrik.com. And particularly, I'll call out the Microsoft partner page there on the Rubrik site. And, thank you again for tuning in. And David, I'll go ahead and hand it back to you.
All right, great discussion. I learned so much during that discussion with Mike and Carl and Natasha. I really appreciate it. I've brought back on now our experts from Rubrik and Microsoft to join us here and take audience questions. So let's see, some great questions coming in. I do want to just take a second, remind everyone about the handouts tab right there before anyone possibly drops off. Don't forget about the Rubrik and Microsoft ebook. It's right there, the BCDR with Zero Trust Data Security ebook. You can download that, check it out for additional information, and also links to the Rubrik Forrester Wave press release and the State of Data Security report, and then back to part 1 of this series as well. So make sure you check out the links in the handouts tab. Let's see. First question, I think this one's for you, Mike. Claude out there in the audience is asking, let's see, they say business continuity is dependent on a business impact assessment. What's your insight on this, or what are your thoughts around that statement?
Yeah, that's an actually great comment, because we have these sort of impact assessments, and then we have our business continuity plans, and they're all kind of similar. So like an impact assessment is really something you're using to sort of predict the disruption of your business, like during some sort of event. So that could be, anything from some sort of physical damage to your building, or maybe you can't get into your building, a power outage, things like that. So they kind of go hand in hand. So as you're doing sort of those business impact assessments, the business continuity plan should be sort of compared to that, or apply those impact assessments to your continuity plan, just to see, how that would play out. So if you couldn't get in your building, can you still execute your business, your BCDR plan, things like that. It's always good to question yourself and, prepare for many different events.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That's smart. Another good question here, this one from Eric. In a ransomware event, how does Rubrik ensure that you're not restoring the ransomware only to get encrypted again? Mike?
Yeah, that's a great question, because the last thing you want to do, obviously, is go through this entire process and just restore whatever malware or ransomware, whatever attack you had back into your environment, and just have it get into this crazy endless loop. So within Rubrik, we do provide a number of value add services. So we're not just backup and restore, obviously. So we do scan those backups, look for, use machine learning algorithms to look for signs of ransomware. But the way we sort of stop things from, reinfecting your environment is through a service that we call threat hunting. And what that does is it allows you to use YARA rules. So these rules that a lot of security professionals are using now to identify and hunt through your backups to find when the ransomware or when the malware actually entered your environment within those backups. And from there, you can essentially quarantine that within the backups and just restore the good data. So that allows you to make sure that you're, not getting into this endless loop of restoring your environment.
Smart. Yeah, I like that. This is a good question from Satyam, who wants to know, what's the most important aspect of planning for BCDR? What do you think, Mike?
Well, there's lots of important aspects. We went through 5 here. There's obviously more. I would say the absolute most important thing, though, is that you actually test your plan. So we put that number one on the list for a reason. There's lots of tools to help you document your plan and create those plans as well. But definitely test your plan. I would say you can write as long and as specific plan as you have. But if you don't test it, hopefully it's not going to be useful for you. So.
Yeah, and just adding on to that, because Mike, we're having a little bit of trouble with your connection. The thing that Mike said, and I'll re-emphasize it, is the most important part of the plan is to test your plan. That being our number one ingredient that we all agreed is important. And adding to that, again, we'll go back to the point we made about that gives you good information about where there are opportunities for improvement, where there are opportunities to personalize it to your company's plan. And if you go back and really read through the NIST standards, they're there as guidance, best practices. Again, not a term invented by any software or tech company, but government and other agencies that have really studied this and looked at it, they can't account for everything that you're going to need either. So that testing piece really has a lot of intel that's personal to you to help you evaluate those decisions.
Great point, Natasha. I love that. Test your disaster recovery plan and your backups. I think we're starting to run out of time here. We've covered most of the questions that have come in. If folks are interested in what they've learned today, they want to learn more, Natasha, what do you recommend?
The number one thing I'll leave folks with is the in the spirit of exactly what we just discussed with testing, something really, it's both fun, and I do think that work should be fun, and we, want to make our jobs lovable. But besides that, very practical. The reason that testing your plan and doing tabletop exercises works is because of the experience of actually doing it. And Rubrik and Microsoft have come together to run these events called Save the Data. And you can look that up on the Rubrik.com site, or if you just even search Rubrik and Save the Data, you can find pretty easily the calendar of events that are coming up. They run locally in different locations, and then also we regularly have virtual versions of that event. And I will say that I have not heard anybody have a bad experience with that. It is always rave reviews, and very, very important for helping them with their planning and evolving. And that again is either, like we just discussed, that baseline or helping evolve it. So check out Save the Data at Rubrik.com. That would be my number one thing to leave folks with today.
All right. Excellent advice. Save the data over at Rubrik.com. I think this is a great place to wrap up. Mike, Natasha, and Carl, it's been great having you on. I learned so much about the top 5 ingredients for modern business continuity and disaster recovery. This is a great piece of content here with some wise advice for us, especially as we move forward towards the new year, that I think will be applicable to so many companies out there. I do want to remind everyone to check out the handouts tab. There is the Rubrik and Microsoft Zero Trust Data Security ebook right there for download, as well as a number of other resources. And of course, thank you to Rubrik and Microsoft for supporting us on the event today. Thank you to the entire Actual Tech Media audience for joining us. And before we go, I do want to announce the winner of our Visa $300 gift card. This is going out to Kevin Hanlon, who is in California. Congratulations, Kevin Hanlon from California. I hope everyone has a great day. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.